Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Mark Turner aho. Thank you for coming along today to this talk about indicators Aotearoa. I'm sorry you can't be here in person, but that's the way things work in this new world we're in. So I'm going to talk about how Indicators Aotearoa was created, and then my colleague Maya will talk about some of the nuts and bolts behind it. So the big story that we want to get across today is that we've been involved in exploring what matters to New Zealanders, and we've had quite a successful project of putting together some key indicators of well-being. And now we're really at the stage of looking at how we can involve more people in using this information, understanding it, and making more use of it, as the Minister just said in her introduction. So this is sort of the overview of what we want to talk about. We're going to talk about where it all began and what the vision is for Indicators Aotearoa. We're going to look at what is well-being and the framework, the section on how do we actually measure it, so how do we develop the measures, what were the challenges, and then Maya will take over and talk about the under the hood stuff, about the workflow and infrastructure and the portal functionality of the website that we use. We'll quickly talk about really what we're interested from people today is how do we communicate the measures to not to our government users, but to the general population and NGOs and people who want to use it for sustainable development goals. And that brings us to our final section, which is what actions should we take from here, including potential for collaboration in future. So why did IANZ come about? Initially, this relates to the government's wellbeing budget and the need to create an independent picture of progress through a wellbeing and sustainable development lens. What really, this really boils down to the fact that what gets measured gets managed. So what that means is originally we looked at just an economic view of progress using GDP, and the realization internationally and within New Zealand was that it's much larger than just an economic view of what is well-being for the country. So the idea was to support a well-being approach to decision making, so the government can take a wider view of what is well-being. We wanted to be inclusive in our design and development process, so this means that we wanted all New Zealanders to be involved in not just using this product, but in actually developing and designing it in the first place. And really importantly, we wanted to present the data, the indicators, in a way that's easy to understand for the general public, for government, and for other users. This is a diagram that looks at, over on the left here, we have Ngā Tūtohu Aotearoa, which is our indicator set. And the really important point here is that we would be a base for wellbeing indicators that are used, but people would use other key data and information as well as our work. So, for example, if we talk about our role with Treasury, they have a living standards framework that the Minister talked about before. They have a number of indicators that they draw from us, but they also have a number of other indicators that come from other sources. So the living standards framework is a policy tool, so it needs information that is actually available, whereas Indicators Aotearoa is more of an aspirational data set. So some of our indicators don't have data yet. So the living standards framework will draw on other data sources while we don't have that information available. So the idea is that these sorts of organisations will use our indicators plus others to then come up with information that is used by government decision makers. So this is not just for government decision makers, but this sort of model works for anyone. So it's about NGOs and local government can also use Ngā Tūtohu Aotearoa as the basis, use other information, pull it all together, and then help use that to look at what's going on for wellbeing and decision making. So the other reason that Indicators Aotearoa came about was something you're probably all familiar with, which is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And really, it was shown that there's a need to ensure that there are appropriate indicators and adequate data to regularly measure the progress that we're making towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And this document calls for accessible, quality, timely, and reliable disaggregated data that helps us to make sure that no one's left behind, and that we need to go beyond just measuring GDP. So Ngā Tūtohu Aotearoa contains wellbeing indicators that reflect an internationally growing vision to provide a more holistic view of wellbeing and sustainable development. Because its wellbeing is multidimensional, it can't easily be expressed in one measure. The international best practice is to use a dashboard of measures, and it's really important to understand that Ngā Tūtohu Aotearoa is not a wellbeing framework, it's an indicator framework. So it can't explain how or why certain things affect wellbeing. But really, we suggest that you take each indicator as a sign of progress in a specific area that contributes to our overall wellbeing. So each indicator is an indicator of what's going on in wellbeing in this multidimensional idea, but they are all independent. And using each of these indicators, it enables the public to have a transparent view of New Zealand's progress, and also the visible trade-offs that are made when we look at wellbeing. So obviously there's no one here to ask questions, so we're going to move on. So how did IANZ come to life? What is wellbeing? So as you're probably aware, New Zealand was the first country in the world to embed wellbeing and sustainable development in its budget decision-making process. And we're really, that means that wellbeing is more than just GDP when it comes to the budgets and government's departments' decision-making and justification for funding for their work. They have to look at not just its impact on a narrow focus, but also its wider impact on wellbeing. So in terms of wellbeing, we're taking the approach that from Amartya Sen, from his influential book, Development is Freedom, that wellbeing is the capabilities of persons to lead the kind of lives they value. So if we're doing that, we really need to ask, what does wellbeing mean to you? So that meant that we needed to ask New Zealand, what is wellbeing to them? We also needed to align it with the Sustainable Development Goals, as we've just seen in the previous slide, that it's that's part of the reason that this project was developed. We needed to align it with the Treasury's Living Standard Framework, and we needed to align it with the He Aratahi Tātaranga, which is New Zealand's multi-statistical framework. So this is the process that we undertook to get to where we are now. So the first thing we did was to engage with people to discover what they thought of what wellbeing is. We then needed to consider all the things that we'd heard and confirm with experts that we're on the right track. We then needed to source and publish this information. And then we then needed to go back to our stakeholders to see if we were on the right track. And now the part that we're really interested in is engaging with stakeholders and the general public and NGOs and people who are interested in sustainable development to improve the usability of our website and the information that's contained there. So the first thing we did was to, in this engage and discover, was to think about a framework of how we're going to put these indicators together and some principles and technical criteria. So this is the road that we traveled down. The starting point was to evaluate existing frameworks to see which would be a good fit for Aotearoa. And we came up with the Conference of European Statisticians recommendations on measuring sustainable development, otherwise known as the CES. This represents international best practice and aligns with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It really examines three key areas that are important to sustainable development and the SDGs. One is our current well-being, which is reasonably self-explanatory. The second is future well-being. So what do we leave behind? And I think a good example of that is fish stocks. So if we were to say that current well-being is that fish is good, but future well-being is that we need to leave fish stocks behind for the future, so there's fish available for those that come after us. Then the third part is well-being elsewhere, so transboundary well-being. This is a crucial part of the Minister's key address this morning around our Pacific neighbours, for example. So it's quite a complicated, well, it's not that complicated, but it's not used that often within existing frameworks of well-being. So I'm just going to flick through to the next slide, which talks a little bit about the definition of this transboundary implication. So really it's saying that how does well-being that we have in our country affect the well-being of citizens in other countries? So from our fish stocks example, we can leave fish stocks in New Zealand waters, but if we fished out all the fish in Tongan waters, then we're having an impact on the rest of the world. And that, probably a more salient example is the greenhouse gases that we emit. So our framework that we use takes into account current well-being, future well-being, the stocks that we leave behind, and our impact on the rest of the world. So the guiding principles that we chose to use for our indicators in our selection process, was that the indicators needed to be outcome focused. And what that means is that a lot of the indicators that were suggested to us were more outputs, and those are things like, say, for example, alcohol and drug use, things like that, which have an impact on health, but the outcome would be health. So it allowed us to reduce the number of indicators and really just look at the outcomes for well-being. The second point was that it should be relevant to New Zealand and incorporate Te Ao Māori perspectives. So the CES that I just talked about is very Eurocentric. So we added in our own sections on culture and Te Ao Māori into this framework so that it has more of a New Zealand flavour. Movement on the indicators should be positively or negatively associated with progress. So this is really important, and it distinguishes an indicator from a statistic. So for example, if we had an indicator of mental health status and we chose to use access to helplines, the number of people accessing them could go up or down depending on government funding, rather than just the actual what's going on for mental health status. So we chose indicators that were, you knew that if they're going up or down, what that actually meant. We decided to include objective and subjective measures. So for example, with health, if we looked at people's health status, the subjective measure is what do you feel, how do you feel your health status is? And the objective is more from the Ministry of Health, amenable mortality or healthy life years that people live. So, some people said we should just use objective measures, but we thought we should use subjective as well. We went with parsimony, so less is more. We really decided that selection should not be data driven. So we wanted an aspirational data set. So therefore we looked at what was important to New Zealanders, even if we didn't have the data available. And that's where it differs from something like the Living Standards framework, where they have to have data to drive policy. So we've got indicators that are currently blank, in fact about 40% of them, but they're aspirational, and then what New Zealanders think we should be doing to evaluate wellbeing. And finally, it should provide a complete picture. So once we had our principles and framework, we went out for public consultation. We had a number of channels that we used. We had postcards. For those that are not online, we had an online poll, submissions from emails, etc. So this link down the bottom here is a detailed report on the consultation and engagement process that we went through. And this is a word cloud of some of the results we got back for what people thought should be, or what they felt was subjective wellbeing. We also went out to a number of community engagements all around the country and spoke to specific community groups. So for example, we had sessions specifically with Māori or Pacifica. We had sessions with the elderly or school children, and even homeless, to find out what is wellbeing to you, what matters most to New Zealand. So once we had these, the public consultation, we then took those to technical workshops. So there were 19 technical workshops where we brought together data and subject experts to look at each section. So for example, there might have been a technical workshop on all the health indicators. So they were all people who were interested in the subject matter, but also data experts coming together to develop the right set of indicators for all these different areas, these 19 different areas. And they came to about 300 indicators. And then we had a indicator selection event where we brought together a number of experts and whittled that 300 down to a final set of 100. So once we'd done that engagement, we then considered and confirmed what we had. So we sent the list of indicators out for peer review nationally and internationally, with specific consultation with Māori. Once we had the peer reviews, we took these the peer reviews to an appraisal panel, which was a small group of experts who spent 2 days going through the indicators and the framework and coming up with the final set, which the government statistician then signed off. Throughout this process, which took about a year, we had concurrent Māori partnership and design going on, but as you probably can see, a year isn't a long time. And obviously any comprehensive framework for wellbeing needs to consider both the wellbeing of Māori and Māori conceptions of wellbeing. So the engagement that we had was interrupted by COVID, which a lot of things were. And about the same time as this interruption, we found out that there were a lot of other government departments also doing looking at wellbeing. So we decided to come together, and we now have just recently, Te Pone Kukuri has appointed someone to lead a Māori-led and government-supported way of looking at what is wellbeing in a Te Ao Māori perspective. So all the government departments that were previously working on it are now helping out with that, but it is absolutely, it's being Māori-led, so that the government departments are just there to lend support to develop the suite of Te Ao Māori indicators. So are we there yet? So after all this work, we came to a system where we could look at current wellbeing, and these are just on this slide here. We can see there's 18 topic areas, and under each of these topics are a number of indicators. So we had current wellbeing was the largest. We had future wellbeing, which talks about what we leave behind. And we had transboundary impacts, so our impact overseas on climate, on waste and things like that. We also had a number of contextual indicators, which don't actually add to the wellbeing indicators, but they put those wellbeing indicators in context. And I've got a link here to the website where we've got this. This was time for some questions, but obviously there's no one there to ask questions of, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to point out that as part of the goodie bag for the conference, there's a copy of an infographic that we have just recently done, which looks at just a selection of indicators that we have, and just putting those out there to say how is wellbeing in Aotearoa New Zealand at the moment. So it's just a selection. What we actually have is 109 indicators. So these are just a selection of a dozen or so of those.
Hey Mark, there's
Yes.
a great news. Actually, we've got 51 people here in the chat and the live session. So yeah, we might have some questions after all, but maybe not at this stage because people did join like in the middle of the presentation.
Okay. So just to recap then, we have done a fairly extensive consultation on the indicators that we have. And now we have developed a set of indicators for looking at wellbeing from a sustainable development perspective, and that can measure the sustainable development goals as well. So I want to just quickly look at some of those measures so far, but they're all available on our website. and then we'll look at some of the challenges and the data gaps that we have in our indicators, where we get those indicators from, and then Maya's going to take over and talk about the under the hood stuff, so how we actually go about displaying these indicators. So this is just just one way of looking at the indicators. So I previously said we look at current, future, and elsewhere indicators, but another way of cutting them is by looking at social indicators that we have: environmental, economic, cultural, and then those contextual. So some people find it easier to look at them by current, future, and elsewhere, but most people seem to want to look at indicators by these four ways: so social and environmental. And I've just got a screenshot here of our social indicators that were on the slide before. So we've got under social, we've got things like health, knowledge, safety, social connectiveness, and subjective well-being. And so if you're on the website, you click on any of these and see the indicators that are underneath them. And as I say, there's a full list of indicators downloadable in an Excel spreadsheet from our website, from the About page on the website. So we have 109 indicators plus an extra 19 contextual indicators. And we actually have 5 double ups. And what that means is some of the indicators are about what's going on currently, but they're also going to have impacts on the future. So greenhouse gas emission has an impact now, but it also has an impact elsewhere. So the one indicator can be used in 2 spots. So sometimes we talk about having 130 indicators and sometimes 109. So if it gets a bit confusing, that's why. We have 96 of these indicators that align with Sustainable Development Goals, but 34 of these currently have no data. And I think it's really important to, for those that didn't hear earlier on, is that our indicators Aotearoa is a aspirational data set where we asked New Zealand what is important to you. So some of the things that were important to them, there just simply isn't data for at the moment. And so an example of that would be health equity. So, you know, do all New Zealanders have equal access to healthcare, to quality healthcare? That's something that we don't have data for, but that we want to have data for. Most of our indicators are annual, if not less regular than that. So if you can see from this pie graph here, you know, we don't have very many quarterly or even more monthly indicators. So a lot of them run annually or even less regularly than that. And that's because we've chosen gold standard indicators that can be disaggregated. And that disaggregation is a really important part of our selection criteria for an indicator. So can we look at not only the progress on that indicator, but what's going on for groups within that indicator? So if we're looking at quality of life, we want to be able to look at quality of life by ethnicity, by region, by sex, and by age groups. So those indicators just can't be done every day. They're expensive to run because they need large samples in order to do them. So the frequency of data use isn't as regular as we'd like. And some of them are, you know, like we have census data, which is 5 yearly. We have general social survey data, which is 3 yearly. So, but if we look at this other pie graph here, we can see there's a reasonably good selection of a distribution of indicators over the social, economic, environmental, and contextual. What we don't have is a large number of cultural indicators, and that's where the work that's ongoing now, being overseen by Te Pone Kaukuri, will enable us to have Te Ao Māori perspective in there and increase the number of cultural indicators. So the Auditor General's report that's going to be talked about in the next session, their recommendation 6 from that report is that the indicators and associated data should be sufficiently disaggregated so that it can be used to assess progress for all defined groups, and especially those considered the most vulnerable. And so that's where this disaggregation is needed. Only 33 of the 109 indicators that we have are disaggregatable by things like sex, ethnicity, or age. And that's really shows how difficult it is to get this sort of data that's required to assess the most vulnerable groups when it comes to the SDGs and looking at what matters for New Zealanders. So this is probably the most important slide of the deck. This is just yet another way of slicing and dicing the indicators that we have in Indicators Aotearoa, and that is by what indicators we have for each of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see here, I've just got the first two. There's a big long list on this page here on the website. But if we were looking at hunger and sustainable agriculture, this is the list of indicators that we have that fit that number 2 on the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've got biodiversity, we've got soil health, we've got greenhouse gas emissions, ecosystem services. So these are what New Zealanders say are important for them when it comes to Sustainable Development Goals. And you can, if you were working on these one or two of the Sustainable Development Goals, you could go to our website and see what data we have available currently for measuring each of these goals. And as I said earlier, which most of you probably didn't hear, is that we are a base set of indicators. Probably for a lot of people's work on monitoring what they're doing, they'll need to bring in other indicators, but the Indicators Aotearoa can be used as the base to this. Challenges and data gaps. As I've already said, we have a lot of data gaps because we're an aspirational data set. Mainly the gaps are environmental. So 23 of the gaps currently are in the environmental space, 13 in the social. And we also have a number of proxy indicators, which is not quite the gold standard that we'd like, but at least it's something out of the 109 indicators. So once again, the Auditor General's report is saying that we really need to get on and add indicators to allow for the regular monitoring of progress. And there are significant data gaps in what we do have. One thing that I will mention is that there is a data investment plan, which is a whole of government plan looking at the data sphere and what gaps there are. And so Indicators Aotearoa has had a fed into that in a big way. And we have that report coming out soon on what the government should invest in terms of strengthening up the data system that we have. So the data gaps that we have in Indicators Aotearoa fed into that plan in a big way in terms of what the government should be prioritising for spending money on for developing new measures. Our suppliers, so as part of Statistics NZ, 3/4 of the data that we have actually comes from our own organisation, which is really useful, but we have a number of other organisations that we get information from. So we use the Ministry of Health for the health survey, we use the Ministry of Education for some of the international, how young people are doing for their reading and writing and science, maths scores, things like that. So I'm now going to hand over to Maya, who's going to tell us a bit about how we actually source and publish this information.
Kia ora koutou. Before I actually go to those nitty-gritty technical details, I just want to steal some of the precious time of our presentation just to say huge appreciation to the organizers of this event, because it's been really challenging to adjust to this situation, and huge thank you and appreciation to our technical support and to people who were very resilient waiting for the links to be available. Thank you. Mark, we do have some questions from the chat. Maybe do you think it's a good time to address some of them?
Absolutely.
So first question was by Kelly. Kelly, would you like to ask it by yourself?
Sorry, Kelly, that wasn't a great. I think there's a problem with your voice, but the question you asked in the chat was that the indicators, how well are they lining up with the United Nations indicators set by the SDGs? Yes,
that's a really good question. Thanks, Kelly. So this, the framework that we chose is based on the SDGs. It's one of the international gold standards. And we have an alignment page on our website that shows how our indicators line up under each SDG. A lot of them aren't identical to what the SDG progress indicators are, because they're not relevant to New Zealand. So our indicators are what are New Zealanders saying are relevant to them. And I'm not sure if people didn't see that part of the discussion. We went out to New Zealand and asked them what's important to them. So we have, like under the SDGs, they have a poverty being $1 a day, or whatever it is. We don't have that. We have our own measure of poverty. So they are under those indicators, but they're not the exact indicators that the SDGs suggest. So one of the things about the SDGs is that you can come up with your own indicators, and that's what we've done. But they're all based on aligning with the SDGs.
Mark, we also have a couple of more questions. I might just read them out.
Yeah, that might be best.
Yes, because there seems to be some problem with audio. So Shay Singh asks us about, is there a timeline for providing housing quality data, as housing quality has a big impact on the occupant health and well-being? This is particularly critical for the vulnerable communities.
That's a great question. So what we are waiting on, we don't have the housing quality data. That's one of our data gaps. We're waiting on HUD for that, which is the new Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. They're working on that at the moment. We're in contact with them and are waiting for their measure. Now, one of the things that we could do is put in some proxy data. So, for example, from the census, we have a lot of information on housing quality, but we're preferred to leave it blank and wait for the HUD the HUD indicator to be developed. So that may seem a bit of a cop-out, but we thought it was really important that we use what the government wants, or what the government is going to put as the gold standard for measuring housing quality.
All right. The next question is about disaggregation from national to local level. Do we have any?
Now, that is one of the hardest things about this. I'm going to say the short answer is mostly not. And that's a huge problem in terms of for our surveys that we do as a nation. People may be aware that things like the General Social Survey can be disaggregated down to regional council level, but not much lower than that. So a lot of the information that is available just isn't available at that local level that a lot of NGOs and people want it to be. So we are aware that's our biggest problem. The problem is that it costs a lot of money to do, you need a lot of people in a survey to be able to look at that low level information. One answer is to use admin data, which we're looking at, but a lot of the questions on well-being just aren't answered by admin data. You can infer stuff from admin data, but you can't, if you want to know about how people feel about their quality of life or their life satisfaction or loneliness, you can't infer that from admin data. You've got to ask people about it. So it's really hard to get enough people in a survey to get it down to that low level.
All right, we're getting more and more questions, Mark. Do you think we should address them straight away and then try to compress the rest of the slides to fit in the time limits?
I think we'll take one more question now, and those questions aren't going anywhere. So if we've got time at the end, we can get back to them.
Okay, so the next question is this data fitting into the Sustainable Development Solutions Network report that is issued each year?
The short answer is currently no. So the voluntary national report that was sent to the United Nations was done by Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and that didn't use our data. It used data from a number of sources. But that's one of the things we're looking at working in, is how do we use what we have here to enable reporting on our sustainable development goals. And that's also one of the questions that was asked by the Auditor General report. So I'm really looking forward to their talk next on what they've just tabled to Parliament. So we're going to move on. And Maya, if you want to talk about what's under the hood in terms of our website, there may be some questions on that.
Yes, I'm just very cautious about the time. I just want to let people know that all the technical stuff that we use to bring this website live is available for others to replicate for their own data. It's available to be downloaded from GitHub. And we are very keen on sharing our experience. If people have any questions related to our workflow or infrastructure map. So could you please go back one slide? Yeah, I'll just quickly. Yeah, so if anyone, I understand that methodology questions might be much more important today at this session. So we'll probably skip this technical discussion. But again, if you have any questions or interested in learning more, please reach out. And yeah, you can go and have a look at our GitHub repository. But I do have a look at the functionality of the website. So on our main page, one of the we publish our application as a Shiny app, which provides a lot of functionality, interactive plots, and ability to download data for a selection of indicators in a single click. So you can choose what indicators you want to download, and you will be given flat files or CSV files. Moreover, users can search indicators by their name or keyword, or just browse through their list by categories. And there is also a very useful section on alignment, which Mark has already mentioned. So it's very interesting to see how our indicators align with different frameworks, not only SDG goals. And finally, users can always get in touch with an information advisor if they have any questions or need any help navigating the website. So please reach out. Coming soon is Te Reo Māori version of the website. We are really excited about that. Please come back a couple of days later. This week it should be live. We also aim to improve the accessibility of the website, so it's an ongoing work. But again, we'll appreciate any feedback on the usability. So when you hit the page for each individual indicator, you'll have a brief description of what it is about, how it was developed, some key facts and summary information. You will also have a drop-down menu of sub-series if they're available, and the graphs will change accordingly. And finally, you have a link to the source or data provider. Coming soon, we are going to put a next update date for each indicator so that users can see when to expect the next release. All right, shall we go back to questions at this stage? So the next question is sort of referring back to the alignment with UN framework. Does it make it hard to measure the global progress?
Yes, I mean, what we are as a statistical agency is providing the indicators, and it's up to other people to actually interpret that. So we're setting out the information with indicators that we know are gold standard, that have the right psychometric properties and can be disaggregated as much as possible. But as a statistical agency, we see our role as providing the data for others to use. And so that probably a lot of people didn't see the original slide that I put up, which showed that we have, these 109 indicators, but it's up to other people to then interpret that information with other data sources for their own needs. So that might be for international UN requirements. It might be for your local NGO looking at what the issues are in a community. Obviously, we don't have a lot of that low-level data that you'd require for that, but more so at a regional or national level, you're able to do that. So short answer is we think it's up to other people to interpret the data that we're supplying. So I think we'll move on to who's using the information and what we want to do with it next. So recently we've been out to a lot of our stakeholders and asked them what they think, and we're trying to find out who our users are. So far, we have an online survey on the website, and we've found out that we have a number of researchers and students accessing the site, NGOs. We have around 20% international visitors to the website. We have a number of people who are saying they're just general public, but we also have decision makers and consultants. So really, the people that we've consulted with recently are our government users predominantly, and we're finding out that they just want the data. So Maya showed you the button to click to download the data. That's what they're interested in. They want that data in a flat file so they can then go away and do their own thing with it. And that's one of the services we think we provide. But really, what we're interested in now is other people using it. So not just central government, but NGOs, people who want to look at the Sustainable Development Goals, whether they just want to use those graphs that we provide to look at what's going on for a certain indicator by subpopulations. But, you know, just to have it more available to the general public. And that's really one of the things we had hoped to talk about and discuss with the audience today. Our most frequently downloaded indicators, we can see that they're social indicators, they're not economic. So, you know, I think that says a lot about what people think of well-being that come to it. They're interested in life satisfaction, mental health status, family well-being. They're not interested in GDP in terms of what is well-being. Our key customers value that we're aligning with Sustainable Development Goals and see that continued work on that should be a high priority. And that's what the Auditor General's report is also saying, that we need to fill those data gaps and get on with it. And all of our key stakeholders are obviously thinking that it's important that we have a better measure than just GDP for the wellness of the country. Our customers like to see the full picture of the framework, even when there's data missing, but they would love to see those gaps filled. And they'd also like us to use to fill those gaps data that isn't quite gold standard. So indicators that we have at the moment that are proxy, to put more of those in, but to just indicate that we don't think they're the final measure we're going to use. So that's something we're working on at the moment, is filling those data gaps. Okay, so how do we and don't we use the data? As I said, our key government stakeholders will just download the data. They're not interested in these descriptions, key facts, and graphs. But for other people, this is what we think might be useful. So if we take the example of what's going on for age groups, we can see here on this graph, this is psychological distress by the New Zealand Health Survey, looking at how people reporting high psychological distress in the last 4 weeks. We can see here with the star, and I've just lost my pointer, here we go, that young people, 15 to 24-year-olds, are showing the highest levels of psychological distress compared to, say, for example, the more elderly in the population. Less percentage of them are showing high distress. Another indicator along this lines is loneliness, and once again, young people showing the highest levels of loneliness. A quarter of 15 to 24-year-olds showing loneliness. But when we look at another indicator again, which is life satisfaction, we can see that young people 15 to 24 are showing, good life satisfaction. So the point is that these are complicated issues, and that each of our indicators is only one part of the puzzle. We can't actually interpret this in any meaningful way, apart from putting the data out there for people to use. And that's a challenge, obviously, for how we use this data. Government can use it for looking at their progress, but it's about how do we incorporate all these various indicators into an overall picture of well-being. And another issue, say, for example, how are we doing with work? We can see here that wages are going up. So that's a good thing. But the percentage of people who felt satisfied or very satisfied with their job is going down. And the people who were showing work strain, obviously the more hours you do, the higher the work strain. But the point of this slide is to show you all of our data is in a different type of series. So this is, a data series that goes back over, a number of years for the medium hourly earnings. This one here only goes back 3 yearly, looking at people who are satisfied with their job. So, comparing these two is very difficult. And this one, we only have the one time point, which is December 2018. So all of our data sources come from, different ways of displaying it and different ways of recording it, because they're from different organizations. But they're all brought together so that each indicator shows a different piece of the puzzle, the pie, which is our overall well-being. But we're not saying that we can say how wages have an impact on job satisfaction. We're just saying that here's the wages, here's the satisfaction. They're separate pieces of the puzzle. So the focus, we're trying to be all things to all people. We acknowledge that, but we're now trying to engage to improve our usability. We have the data sets for experienced users. We have simple graphs for less experienced with descriptions of each indicator and just key facts. As a stats organization, we need to adhere to strict data standards that can make the data less interpretable. We leave it up to others to interpret the data. As someone asked just before, we have each indicator that people can then look at, take the data and interpret it their own way. But what we really want to do is address the needs of the general public. And we think that's important so that people can look at changing behaviors and attitudes and what's going on and find out about the data that's influencing their lives. What IANZ isn't, so Ngā Tūtohu Aotearoa isn't a framework for wellbeing that can show how different indicators can affect wellbeing. So what are the interactions? What it can do, it shows changes in individual indicators that contribute to our overall wellbeing. So each indicator has a contribution, but we can't say how that they interrelate. What we can do is show a selection of wellbeing indicators that have been rigorously reviewed and that can be used by others. So what's next? I've put down a couple of things here. Perhaps we need a headline indicator dashboard. So because there's so many indicators, we can just get a core group of 15 to 20. People can have a much better picture in one place of what's going on for wellbeing in these different areas. Perhaps if we use unit record data, we can start doing predictions of or how different aspects of wellbeing interact. But really what we're going to do is start looking at these data gaps. I'm going to quickly hand back to Maya.
All right. Thank you everyone for your questions. It seems that everyone here is very passionate for making a positive difference in our society. And we all know how good quality, reliable data is important. And that's what we've done at Stats. We've built a foundation for future work. But how do we really close this gap between the data and actual change for everyone, not only decision makers, and how can we reach its widespread usage? So one possible answer to this might be to make data personal and deliver an actionable message. But we here at Stats, we cannot really reach this point because our main target is to provide data in its purest form, so that other people can use it and make assumptions and make it actionable. So, but to reflect this point of how we can actually promote our data to be used by others, we came up with a so-called engagement pyramid. So essentially we were trying to brainstorm what points and in which order does the data need to hit to engage both with decision makers and general public. So the way we see it, that what we've delivered here is we recognize there's a need for data, and we now know what's important to measure. We now know how to measure it. We collected the data, although some data gaps still remain, and we are working really hard on closing them. And we disseminate the data for everyone to use. So what can be done next? What questions can general users ask to start actually using this data is, what is in it for me? Are we there yet? Where am I in this data, and what I can do better? Am I doing enough? These are not easy questions to answer by no means, but we are aware that there are so many great initiatives around in New Zealand, so many enthusiastic people. We are very certain that we'll find a way to make our data useful. So what can we do next? Stats New Zealand is working on increasing granularity, and I know that in the chat questions a lot of concern was expressed around disaggregating the data and making it more granular. So we are working on it. It would be really nice to see the breakdown not only by gender, regions, age, but also by disability status, migration, parent status, sexual identity. There are many more groups of population that can be covered, and this is an exciting piece of work, ongoing work. What else we can do? We can measure the progress, the overall progress, to sort of reflect the whole picture. It would be great for users to go select, for example, an SDG goal and see where is it moving? Are we improving the situation in New Zealand or not really? If not, in which particular area we are not sort of investing enough effort. So we are working on showing the whole picture. It's not easy to be done because the data is very diverse. It's not easy to sort of compile it together and to come up with a baseline and understand what's good, what's bad, is it good enough? Because the data can be presented as time series, percentages, categorical data. So it's also work in progress. But what other people can do with our data, you can relate a story and make it more personal to users. We can help users find themselves in data. We can give advice and guidance on what this data can be used for or who's responsible for a particular measure, and we can help users monitor the individual contribution. But once again, this is not exactly the focus of our project. So we are very much willing to share the data, to share access to it, to provide advice and consultation on how it can be used, and to hear any feedback, whether it's on data, methodology, usability, or any great ideas about collaboration that you might come. So please reach out. Please get in touch. These are our email addresses. Join our mailing list to get timely updates about indicators that you're interested in. Have a look at our website. Have a look at our GitHub repository. If you're keen on replicating the app itself, we are also very eager to help. So yes, please ask your questions and reach out.
So I think we're almost out of time, but I just want to reiterate what Maya's just said about getting in touch, looking at our website and giving us feedback on what's good, what's bad, what's ugly. We really want to know where to from here. We know we need to fix the data gaps. We know we need to have better disaggregation, and we know we need to explain it better, but we need help with doing that. So I think the next talk coming up is around the Auditor General's report, and I just picked out 3 of the recommendations that I think are most important to us today. So the first one that I've chosen, these are just in random order, is the government needs to clarify its commitment to the 2030 agenda. The government should build on what we're doing in the Living Standards Framework to ensure that we can add extra data and disaggregated data. And the third one that I thought was really important today is that the government needs to develop a stakeholder engagement strategy to raise awareness of the SDGs. And so I think that's really exciting, and I'm looking forward to the rest of today.
Can I quickly just chime in? There was a brilliant idea in the chat that to save us some time, we might want to answer all those questions in a single sort of document and circulate it together with the presentation, recording, and all the goodie bag that we've got, Mark. So maybe we'll just spend next hour, a couple of hours answering those questions, and then Tony will help us circulate it to all the participants, because a lot of questions are really interesting, and I would really, be sad to miss those out. But I think that everyone wants to know the answers to those really important questions. So, okay, I'm shouting up.
Yeah, sorry. This has obviously been a little bit disorganized, but we really look forward to hearing from you all, and please go on the website and send us your feedback. So, and we'd be happy to answer questions. You've got our email address on this presentation as well, email addresses, and as I say, there's facilities on the website itself to do feedback to us. So was there one last question, or should we wrap it up and everyone can have 2 minutes break?
That's great, thank you. Thanks very much, and really appreciate it. And if everyone can show their appreciation for your presentation, and again, want to appreciate thank you to everyone for being thoughtful for us and the difficulties we're having. But as I said, all the links that have been sent out now should work. So I look forward to seeing you in later discussions as well. So kia ora and enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.